Hello, geography students. This is Mr. Everton with your second screencast for this week. And today we're going to talk about political conflict. So, last time we talked about economics and political cooperation. Today we're going to focus exclusively on reviewing political conflicts. We're going to describe factors that can lead to political conflicts. We're going to talk about four different case studies. We're going to talk about Canada. We're going to talk about Israel. We're going to talk about Kurdistan. And we're going to talk about the Cold War. So first, let's talk about Quebec, which is in Canada. During colonization, imperialism, Great Britain created the 13 colonies that would then later become the United States. France had colonies as well, and you can see the French colonies in blue here. And Great Britain and France ended up fighting over control of North America, and you ended up with Great Britain taking control of the French colonies in North America. So Canada has a history of being colonized by both the French and the British, which led to what we call a francophone region, or a part of the world where people speak French. And Quebec, which is part of Canada, which is a French province, is a francophone region where French is an important part of the culture of Quebec, but the rest of Canada speaks English. And so that leads to bilingual signs like the one you see here. This sign, if you translate it, says, "Signs are important. They're speaking to you. Please respect them." Fascinating. In 1995, some citizens of Quebec wanted to basically leave Canada and form their own French-speaking country of Quebec. But the referendum was defeated. The people spoke, and they said, "No." I was going to try to speak more French, but that's not going to happen. Okay, so that's one example of a political conflict, a cultural conflict, specifically a language conflict, where the people of Quebec wanted potentially to politically secede from France because of differences in their French francophone cultural status. Wow. Not particularly articulate this morning. Sorry about that. Now let's talk again about Israel and Palestine. We talked extensively about how the Ottoman Empire controlled Southwest Asia for about 500 years, 600 years. Whew, long time. And then the Ottoman Empire lost World War I, and we ended up with what we called the Mandate System, where Great Britain and France divided up parts of the Middle East or Southwest Asia after World War I. And Palestine, which you see circled here in red, became a British mandate or colony. After World War II, the United Nations became a thing, and the United Nations decided to give a large part of Palestine to the Jewish people who had just gone through the Holocaust and wanted their own homeland. And according to the Jewish scripture, this part of the world was promised to the Jewish people by God. So in 1947, the UN passed a resolution separating Palestine into two countries and giving part of it to the Arabs and part of it to the Jews, creating the Jewish state of Israel. In 1947, the borders looked like this. By 1949, Israel had expanded and taken over some land and connected Jerusalem to the rest of Israel, and had marginalized or made the Palestinian people less important and have less power. In 1967, there was a war fought, the Six-Day War, fought between Jews and Arab countries surrounding them. The Arab countries around Israel did not want Israel to exist. They wanted to try to, give the land back to the Palestinians, and Israel, with support from, the United States military, not like U.S. soldiers, but with U.S. War materials, with tanks and guns and planes provided by the United States, was able to take over the Sinai Peninsula, which was part of Egypt, to take over the Gaza Strip, to take over the West Bank, and to take part of Syria called the Golan Heights. Through different peace treaties, then many of these territories were given back, like Sinai was given back to Egypt. But by 2018, this is what the map looks like. And we have the Gaza Strip and the West Bank are places where Palestinians live, where they have some control, but which are part of Israel and are being controlled by a Jewish state. So this is an example of conflict caused by two different groups of people wanting to live in the same place. Palestinians who've lived here for 1,000 years, who have a strong claim on the land, and then also Jews who lived here before and were dispersed and have been without a nation without a state for thousands of years and have been persecuted and want to have their own land. And you have two different groups of people claiming that land, and that is leading to the conflict in Israel. Now we have the case study of the Kurds. The Kurdish people, live in a region that you can see represented here in yellow. Remember, this is a nation of people, which means that it's an ethnicity, an ethnic group with their own language. They have their own religion, their own customs. They're unified culturally. So it's a nation of people, but they don't have their own government or state that represents them. As you can see, Kurdish people live in all of these different countries: Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, and Armenia. And so it's a nation with no state. Another map representing similar thing. So the Kurdish people have for some time been trying to get their own state ever since the end of World War I, when the Ottoman Empire stopped to be a thing, being a thing, when the Ottoman Empire ceased to exist, and they were drawing lines, the European powers were drawing lines on Southwest Asia and dividing it up and giving it out to different states. The Kurds wanted to have their own country then, and they got left out. Turkey argued that they should get the majority of the land that belongs to the majority of the land where Kurds live. There's a sizable Kurdish minority living in northern Iraq, which you can see here on the map in the dark yellowish, orangish tan color. Excuse me. We talked about this when we talked about the case study of Iraq, and we talked about how there was a war fought in the 1980s between Iran and Iraq, and the Kurds tried to use this war as a way to gain independence from Iraq. They wanted to get out of Iraq and form, their own country, their own state, Kurdistan. And Saddam Hussein, the dictator of Iraq in that time, brutally suppressed the Kurds by using chemical weapons on the city of Halabja. And I showed you a video of that in class, where, hundreds of Kurds in Halabja were killed by chemical weapons. Finally, our final example of political conflict is the Cold War. And this is kind of an economic example. It's also a political example. But we have two different economic systems at work in the Cold War. There's capitalism, where you have a wealthy person controls the capital, controls the factory or means of production, and there's labor or workers who work in the factory for a wage, and they create something to be sold that has value, and when it's sold, they get paid their wage, and then the profit from selling the product goes to the owner of the factory, the capitalist. In the Soviet Union, they practiced, during the 20th century, from 1918 until 1990, the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe had a command economy, or communism, in which the government controlled the means of production. The government controlled the factory and distributed wealth. The goal was for it to distribute wealth equally amongst all the people, and everybody would get the same. So you have an ideological economic conflict where the United States and other Western European democratic capitalist countries all saw the world one way, and And the Soviet Union and Eastern European countries all saw the world another way, and they formed their own alliances. Western Europe and the United States formed the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, and Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union formed the Warsaw Pact. And these two military alliances were constantly, looking out to make sure that they were not attacked by the other. The Berlin Wall is an example of a cultural landscape that is reflecting this conflict. The city of Berlin was literally divided in half, and the western half was controlled by a democratic capitalist government, and the eastern half was controlled by a communist dictatorship. Here you can see that Germany was divided into East and West Germany, and then Berlin, which is located in East Germany, was also divided into West Berlin and East Berlin. So, we've talked about 4 different examples of political conflict. We talked about Quebec, where the people of Quebec potentially were going to leave Canada because of their cultural heritage as a Francophone region. We talked about the conflict in Israel between Palestinians and Israelis. We talked about the conflict of Kurds not having their own nation state. And we talked about the conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union during the Cold War. So your assignment for today is to go watch a video. It's time to draw borders on the Arctic Ocean. This comes from Vox. And you're going to answer the response questions to explain if you think the conflict is about culture, if it's about boundaries, like with Israel, if it's about ethnicity, like with the Kurds, or if it's about economics, like between the United States and the USSR. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll talk to you next time.